We will go from there. Okay. So in terms of what we'll cover, brief overview about what this actually means in terms of the model that we're moving to, in terms of what local policing looks like. A bit more about what it means in terms of neighbourhood policing and response policing. Centre, which is a critical area and under significant pressure, not just here but across the country, and it fits as a key part of the jigsaw with local policing as well. We'll talk very briefly about the new policing plan, which is just our plan for the next 12 to 18 months going forward. So we're not just dropping in a change to local policing, it's part of a wider plan around improving policing in Staffordshire. We'll do a bit of a Q&A and then there's the options for the one-to-ones. Thank you. So in terms of the sort of background and the reason as to why we're changing, well, first of all, the current model, well, the model that was current as of yesterday, was introduced in 2018 in a very different environment for policing around demand, around the numbers of police officers that were available. So there was a decision to move in terms of some of the key elements of the model then around 3 response hubs. So one in Stoke, one in the south, one in the east of the county. What we found relatively quickly, especially coming out of COVID, was that whilst on paper that made sense, in reality in terms of drive times for officers, response officers getting to know their local areas, in terms of the numbers of officers we actually had in response to deal with blue light calls, emergencies, proper time for investigations, caring for victims as opposed to just rocking up to an incident and then having to go to the next, it just wasn't delivering what we were proud of, let alone what communities wanted in terms of the service. So I think COVID probably across the country was probably a little bit of a veil around how effective models were, because if you take about 30% of demand out of your business, if you take 30% demand away from the ambulance service or policing, a model that was based in 2018 arguably probably lasted a little bit longer than it should have, but that was just one of the implications of COVID. We're now in a position where actually our demand coming out of COVID in some areas, especially coming into the contact centre, is even more intense than it was before. So that's a little bit around the model that was introduced in 2018. One of the unique things for me around sort of what we're doing, and I've seen some of the stuff on Twitter this morning about policing reinventing the wheel and who's looking for a promotion on the basis of the change that's being done, which is I suspect it's probably all coming from cops, but I suspect the public probably think the same thing, is why we're doing it and where it came from. Well, probably uniquely for me, the workforce have pretty much told us not just what was wrong, but what they felt would work and what they would connect with. Local communities are really clear that even though there's probably a little bit of a heartbeat appetite for Bobby's walking the bay, every village or hamlet having a police station, and I think they recognise that probably that isn't realistic anymore, or probably isn't even meeting public needs anymore. They do want a local policing service. They want response officers who don't just come in from 30 or 40 miles ago or away and then leave again. They want people who are invested in their area, who are based in Tamworth, based in Cannock, based in Leek, based in Newcastle, based in Burton, recognising they will have to go wherever the risk is, but ultimately they start and finish in those areas and they're visible in those areas. So our own staff, our own communities were pretty clear that the model we were running wasn't working. There wasn't a sense of identity. We weren't as responsive as we should have been. And so the work around this new approach to local policing, or in many ways going back to the way it was done historically, started last summer. And again, Jav and many other people in the room sort of pulled apart why the current model wasn't working, what might a new model look like, talked to staff about what would work, sat down with local council leaders, chief execs and partners to understand actually what would be a better model going forwards, and one which would hopefully survive any future challenges that will come around money, around demand, around maybe even changing government structures as well. And there was a number of areas of focus. One, as I've just alluded to, is we need to be more responsive. We want to get to emergency calls quicker, from the very first point of contact in the control room to actually having a resource arrive. We need to be more responsive. We want policing which isn't just seen as a county policing model. We want it to be very local. So we've got, as we'll see in a minute, 2 bases in Stoke and Trent City, and then 8 bases matching the districts that sit within Staffordshire County. We've talked a bit already, but Emily will probably develop it about this word we use, contact. But the vast majority of people now, if you want to ring the police, it's probably going to be by phone or maybe a digital channel in terms of contact. And that has grown exponentially in the last 5 years alone. And is probably one of the biggest pressure points for policing at the minute, is how do we manage all the calls, all the contact which comes into policing, considering last month, for example, only 21% of all those contacts related to crime. So there's a lot around concern for safety, antisocial behaviour, cats up trees, nuisance neighbours, maybe other organisations like the ambulance service which are really struggling. The people who are constantly there, who will constantly pick up the phone, are the police. So in some ways, we used to be an agency of last resort. We're probably now more first resort as well in terms of the demand that we're picking up. And then around volume investigations, what that means is, you know, from a specialist investigation point of view, the really serious crime, the really complex crime, we're pretty good at. We have skilled detectives. We would like to have more, and we need to have more. But whenever you look at burglary, whenever you look at relatively low harm assaults, whenever you look at maybe fraud investigations, in particular cyber, we need to get better at dealing with all those volume investigations which are increasing, because they're the things that probably most of us will experience over the course of our lifetime, as opposed to maybe the more harmful or complex high-end crimes. So in terms of what we did, and I'll not labour this because we can either tease it out in questions or it may well not be overly relevant, but there was a significant amount of review work, because in policing you can't just, you know, on a hunch change your approach overnight. What we deal with is far too risky and too complex for us to just on a bit of a whim think, right, we'll have a play with a new model and we'll implement it. Plus we're dealing with people, so we needed to take the time to sit down with our staff, talk to them about the moves, talk about the changes. But you'll see the sort of process we went through. You know, the middle batch of bullet points is probably the most important. That even though policing is in some ways a science where we deal with numbers, statistics, you know, we can look at where on paper the best place to actually base a station is. There's a good chunk of this is about art and about professional judgment, listening to communities and listening to staff, but we wanted to have a really strong evidence base behind the approach that we were adopting. Morning. We also then did over 100 face-to-face workshops, a lot of those with staff, about what's working for you, what isn't, because I'm a big believer from a police point of view, whenever you get to the sort of dizzy heights of us, you become further and further removed from the reality of what's actually happening on the ground. So if you don't talk to the constables who are dealing with the calls, if you don't talk to the contact staff, if you don't talk to the sergeants supervising them, if you don't talk to key people on the ground who are receiving our service, you really don't have a sense of what's going on. So those workshops were very much about what's happening and what are the ideas for how we can improve it. And there is a lot of demand and data work in the background. We've been very clear that that we need to stand over what we're doing. We need to measure what success looks like, which isn't just about how people feel. It's about, are we getting to calls quicker? Are we solving more crime? Is public confidence increasing? Are we, you know, turning people away from crime as opposed to just getting quicker at responding to it? So we've got a number of ways of trying to measure what success looks like, recognising that there's lots of other factors as to why maybe we can't solve crime or why we can't get to things as quickly as we would like. So if we flip on, please. So again, pretty briefly, in terms of how we're rebuilding not just local policing, but the whole organisation, on the top left, as you look at it, we've clearly got, as you will have in your organisations, HR and people, we've got leadership development, we've got finance, we've got technology, so that enabling services is key to making this all work. So a lot of our conversations, and Jav was in at 4 o'clock this morning, are making sure that all the plugs that need to be in place to make policing work are actually up and running. So there was a huge amount of work done by our enabling services teams. Corporate development on the top right is very much about how do we plan for the future, how do we deliver change, how do we measure our own performance. Force contact and operations, as I've alluded to, is really, really key about what that first response looks like. How do we care for people? How do we get them the right resource? On the other side, Specialist Crime Command are dealing with homicide investigation, rape and serious sexual offending, complex fraud, etc., etc. And we're doing some additional work with them about how we put more detectives in particular into public protection, because we know the areas around in particular child exploitation, child abuse, whether it be online or in the physical world, are increasing. And then the bottom of the structure is very much what we're probably going to dominate our conversation with today, that what we have at the very top level are two commands locally. It doesn't take a genius to figure out what they are. So Stoke-on-Trent City is one, Staffordshire County is the other, and the two gents are the commanders for those. But as we'll see in a minute, for me what is really, really key are those 10 local policing commands, because day to day that's where we're dealing with most of the people, most of the crime and most of the contacts. So new model, again, different component parts that we'll sort of touch on in a minute, so we'll not labour them. You've got a very clear relationship with the contact centre in terms of just how we push the calls out to the cars, how we monitor progress, how we understand where risk is at any point in time in the county. And whilst it is a local model, we need to be really clear that we are still have a responsibility for policing Staffordshire as a county as well, and there's regional arrangements, etc., etc. So even though we have 10 boundaried areas within Staffordshire, if we need to have resource moving across because we need to keep somebody safe, well then that's what we'll do. Chief supers and chief inspectors, we'll hear a little bit more about their roles. I'll let the guys talk through their teams in a moment. Locally based response teams, which is probably one of the biggest changes of the model. So instead of having 3 sort of large teams based across the county, we're going to 10. So all our response teams now will be in a very local model, and they will be based alongside their local neighbourhood colleagues as well. So that ability, even though they will have different roles, just to share information for response officers to understand the context of community and what's happened and what's important, and indeed for neighbourhood officers as well to appreciate what their response colleagues are dealing with every shift. Basing them in the same place, in some ways actually forcing them to come together, I think makes a big difference. Just around relationships, knowledge sharing, and actually sort of owning each other's challenges and problems as well. Local investigation, from a CID point of view as we call it, previously it sat outside local policing, but what we're doing is now bringing it into the local policing family. So Colin and Will have a responsibility for overseeing the criminal investigation department, who will deal with that more complex level of crime again, not the absolute top end that we've just spoken about, but your more complex burglaries, dealing with your more complex offenders, your more serious assaults. The fact that they're now part of local policing, for me, is pretty key to them understanding again what the context of those investigations are, and how they will support colleagues in response and neighbourhood policing, and not just dealing with those investigations, but dealing with the underlying causes. Could be around county lines work, could be around drug dealing, could be around prolific offenders, maybe around domestic abuse or violence against women and girls, but they will be key around those more complex investigations. And then our harm reduction hubs, which we will touch on in a minute, in trying to sit down with partners, so there'll be 10 of those, one for each area. We've seen within COVID, I think, a real step up about sharing of information, along with health and education, being more focused on actually how do we work with maybe families which use all our services quite regularly, individuals who are vulnerable, or indeed the flip side, individuals who actually are causing a world of pain for all organisations, but more importantly the public. So the harm reduction hubs are about trying to problem solve, intervene much earlier, as opposed to just being better at responding. Next slide, please. So on a slide, there are the new 10 response bases. We obviously have other stations as well that neighbourhood officers will respond out of, but that's the sort of spine of our policing response. So instead of having the 3, which would have been Cannock, Stoke and Burton, we've now gone to the 10. So that is probably one of the defining elements of the model. And if we move on again, we sort of touched on the benefits. So in terms of being more responsive, and in terms of improving quality of investigations, one of the key things that we found, and we'll come to some of the numbers in a moment, is that we just didn't have enough officers in response. And that wasn't just about not being able to get the things as quickly as we wanted, but we weren't giving them enough time to deal with the investigation. So if I called 101 or 999 and response came out, they would deal with the initial things and generally deal with them really well. But actually spending another hour gathering information, giving crime prevention advice, speaking to neighbours, understanding the wider context, maybe linking in with another agency. We weren't giving response officers the opportunity to do that. So they dealt with what they could, I think, very well, but we just didn't give them enough time to invest. So one of the key things we're looking for from this model is, now that we're giving them more time, what will that mean around the quality of investigations that they're going to deliver? And then the bottom bullet points, as I've just alluded to, that we need to be smarter and actually invest a lot more in not just keeping going back to the same areas, the same people, the same families time after time. How do we, with partners, and very often the needs will be around mental ill health, it could be deprivation, it could be challenges around schooling and truancy, but how do we actually sit down and say, right, what is the underlying problem here, as opposed to just dealing with the symptoms of it or the after effects. So problem solving either through our harm reduction hubs or through our investment in public protection has got to be key, because I don't think policing is going to go out of business anytime soon. I don't see the demand for policing reducing in any way. I think COVID, whether it be around vulnerability or impacts of mental ill health, will have a tail to it far beyond the just the medical tail of long COVID. So we need to be prepared in advance for probably seeing more demand coming our way. And the way to deal with that is to understand what are the underlying issues and how do we solve those. Okay. So you've touched on those, so again I'll let you sort of digest the screen. I think the pack will be available for people, Caroline, won't it, in terms of sort of taking away. So those are some of the benefits. If we move on again, you'll hear from the sort of dedicated senior commanders, again, both at chief super level and then at a local level. So if you do want to take in for the public to know who they are and to have that identity with them as well. Talked about investigation crime. This bit in the middle, we know that crimes around domestic abuse, child exploitation, child abuse, online offending, they're only increasing. In fact, whilst it mightn't be quite as dramatic as it's only the tip of the iceberg, there's a lot of crimes that haven't been reported to us. So by investing with more staff and working in a different way around public protection, which are those specialist officers which deal with those, I think from our point of view, we will not only just get a higher quality of service for victims of crime, it's also being fair to our staff who are carrying really high workloads in that area at the minute as well. And then Emily will talk a little bit around the final bullet point around what we're trying to do around our force contact centre. Response officers, we've talked about, that's just a little bit about their role. We're not changing the role of a response officer because we recognise that we need to have people blue lighting to calls, we need to get to things quickly. So there is a difference between response officers, and then the next slide I think should talk about our neighbourhood officers. So they're different roles, but we're bringing them under the one chief inspector, we're putting them in the same place. We are expecting and requiring them to talk more and work more. So if a response officer has half an hour between calls, which isn't that often, they know what area to go to where there's maybe been an antisocial behaviour problem. They know what door to knock on to check on a victim to see if they're okay. So we're starting just to break down some of the barriers that exist perhaps between response and neighbourhood. And then local CID, we've talked a little bit about. Again, we don't have the ability to put them 10 times across the county. They're a relatively scarce resource, but the fact that they're now working within local policing and being held to account by local policing means that they'll not just be really good as they are about investigating crime, but they will be much more plugged into what's relevant to those local communities. Because it may well be in occasions, let's say we have a crime against an older person, which normally would be dealt with by a response officer or maybe even a neighbourhood officer. Because of the age of that individual, because of the impact, we may well allocate that to someone in CID to bring a different type of investigation resource to it in terms of the approach. So there'll be a bit more flexibility than perhaps there is now. And then again, we talked about our harm reduction hubs, so I'll not labour that, but that's the sort of fourth bit of the jigsaw in terms of those local policing teams. They're very much part of the local policing family. We're putting more staff in there, we're bringing training in there, we're bringing new technology in there. Because again, whilst we've been at the sort of forefront of bringing in things like live chat and various social media channels, it's pretty much actually increased the appetite for people to have contact with us, whereas we thought it might actually reduce people calling in on 999s or other elements. There's been some reduction in 101s, but I think whenever you look at the whole package of what we offer, we've actually seen more people making contact with the police, which is a good thing, because we want to hear from people and we'd rather know more than too little. But it's how you then deal with that, process that, and then action what might be in there. And then the policing plan, I sort of alluded to at the start. We're very clear about the vision that we want for Staffordshire, about it being both a safe place but somewhere that feels confident and reassured around crime. It is about a local police service. I think we want to be defined by being a local police service, even though there's crimes that happen in Staffordshire which maybe come from outside the jurisdiction, which are cyber based, but still the vast majority of our crime touches the ground locally. That's what communities relate to, that's what our officers understand as well. And that actually there is a real passion and a commitment about serving the public, and actually about caring for the partnerships we have, but also caring for our own staff. If you look at some of the work that's ongoing at the minute around policing nationally, around well-being, the reality is that what those of us in the room may encounter in our lifetime in terms of traumatic incidents, the reality is that most response officers in particular will deal with that over the course of one shift. So whether it be traumatic injuries, death of a child, a road traffic collision, the things that, you know, maybe we encounter 3 or 4 times over the course of our life, at least in a very intimate way, we've got police officers dealing with those right now, and we'll deal with 3 or 4 of those incidents, if not every shift, on a regular basis. And you scale that up over the course of a career and you're into the thousands potentially of traumatic incidents. So it's all very well me having a plan for what we're going to give the public. There's got to be a parallel approach about what we can give staff, how we can support them and invest in them. And whilst that will be around specialist support, it's also about giving them the right numbers and the technology to do their job as well. So that's our plan. It's sort of focused about what we're delivering for communities, what we need to do in terms of our own people, the partnerships we want to invest in, and then how we use our resources. Because clearly, you know, I've got a police, fire and crime commissioner who holds me to account, not just around what I'm delivering for the public, but how I use my resources as well. And I think we are nearly at the end, at least in terms of sort of my front load. So, any questions for me?